Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Dina Mansour. I'm the Executive Director of the Maureen and Mike Mansfield Center, and I want to welcome you and thank you for being part of the celebration of the 40th anniversary of the Maureen and Mike Mansfield Center. First, I'd like to recognize our founding director, Paul Lauren, is standing in the back of the room there. He is really the reason that we are all here, other than, of course, Maureen and Mike Mansfield. It was Paul Lauren's foresight in working together with Mike and Maureen to shape their legacy. And here we are 40 years later because of the important work that Paul did. So I'm very honored to be able to follow in his footsteps. As you all know, the Mansfield Center fosters globally minded leaders of integrity, that we are here to support the people of Montana and the world in having a better understanding of strengthening democracy and developing international relationships. We have had a fantastic lineup of speakers this year for our 40th anniversary, and incredibly honored to have Ambassador Marie Yovanovitch with us here tonight. So I'm not going to go too deeply into the bios. First, I'm going to tell you a bit about how we will run tonight. We have a packed room, but we also have nearly 300 people joining us by Zoom. So I'll do brief introductions, and following the discussion between our two guests, we will have a Q&A period. There will be people with microphones on both sides of the room, and Joanna will be identifying the next person to get the mic for questions. After our event, the Mansfield Center has purchased a number of copies of Ambassador Yovanovitch's book, and she's graciously agreed to stay afterwards and sign a few copies. So first come, first served. Don't knock people over on your rush out the door. And we will also send a few to the Zoom audience. So if you're on Zoom and you'd like a copy of the book, send in a message and we'll select a few from that. So really, these two incredible servants need very little introduction. They both have had lifelong commitments to our country, to the best interests of democracy, and are here today to share their story. So I want to thank you both for being here, and we'll turn it over to Joanna.
Well, thank you very much, and thanks to all of you here in person, all of you joining us via Zoom. And I just want to reiterate our deep, deep gratitude and appreciation for Ambassador Yovanovitch coming all this way to join us. She's had a very busy schedule today in Missoula. She has had a radio interview. You met with Hellgate High School students, did some media interviews. And here she is tonight, capping off a busy day, sharing her insights with us and talking about her life and her career. The issue of Ukraine could not be more timely. We all follow this very closely in the news. The significance of what is happening there is great. And so we will emerge tonight, I think, with a much better understanding of what is at stake, what U.S. policy could or might be, and any insights too that the ambassador has to share from her own time in that country. As Dina Mansour just mentioned, the ambassador has written a book. I have read it. I commend it to all of you. It is called Lessons from the Edge. It is a New York Times bestseller for good reason. And it does trace her life, her career, the fact that she is a child of immigrants. And so that's a part of her story that I hope she will share as well. So with that, I would like to start with the book. It will allow the ambassador, I think, to introduce herself to us a little bit more. And so why don't we start with the book, why you wrote the book. And I know we will get some of the messages from the book during the evening's discussion, but perhaps you can also say if there are some key points that you think people should take from this book.
Well,
so Ambassador, welcome, and we're delighted to have you.
Thank you very much. And I should just say that I am so grateful to the Mansfield Center for inviting me here to speak with all of you and to come to Missoula, to come to Montana. It's a great experience for me as well. So why did I write the book? So in 2019, as you may know, I testified before Congress in the former president's first impeachment. And there was, I got a lot of feedback from people from all over the world, but mostly, of course, from the United States. I got thousands of letters from people saying, we didn't know about the Foreign Service. We don't know what the State Department does. We had no idea. Tell us more, write a book. And so as I was thinking about what was I going to do next, because I knew at that point that I was going to retire, that there wasn't anything more for me that I would be able to do at the State Department, I thought, well, maybe I should write a book, because it's important that people in America understand what the State Department does and how we protect and defend the interests and the values of the American people. So I set out trying to do that. But I also wanted to honor my parents. My parents were, sort of hardworking people that, probably nobody would write a book about except for me. But I felt the American people and people who read this book should know about my parents because, excuse me, because it was the way they brought me up. It was their influence. It was all due to them that I joined the Foreign Service, that I had, really a wonderful 33-year career that was so meaningful to me, and where I believe I really made an impact on a lot of people, on a lot of American policies. And so I wrote a little bit about my parents as well. They were immigrants who came to the United States with me. And they had grown up, each of them in different countries. My mother in Nazi Germany as a stateless person, my father in what was then Yugoslavia. He was captured by the Germans. They had a very difficult time during that period, as you can imagine. And they slowly made their way west until they ended up in the United States and found sanctuary here. And they were always grateful for that they had an opportunity to live in a country where they could raise their children in peace, where they were not afraid, where they had, where they could worship as they pleased, where they could say what they wanted, where they had the protections of the American Constitution. And so they brought us up to really to think about how we could give back to the United States, a country that had given us so much. And so, that was always in the back of my mind. How do you give back? My parents, and there's so many ways to do that, right? To be a constructive citizen, helping out fellow citizens. I mean, my parents, for example, were teachers and brought up generations of students, both inside and outside of the classroom, and had just a huge impact on many of them. And so I was thinking about that, and I wasn't the greatest student, and I took a lot of detours in my 20s. And then, as I was starting to think that a career in advertising was not the one for me, I went back to my original idea of the Foreign Service, because it married up my need to be a contributing citizen. It married up my passion for history and foreign policy and politics, and my love of travel and trying out different foods in different countries, meeting people from different cultures, languages. It married up all of that, and it came with a paycheck. And so I thought, well, maybe this is a career for me. And so I started down that path, and I was going to say the older age of 27, but actually people join much later. You can join until you're 65, just as a recruitment message to this audience. I joined the Foreign Service, and I had a 33-year career that was really a great career. I mean, I highly recommend it to anybody who's interested in thinking about it.
Well, your career did take you. You were ambassador 3 times, and that has, many challenges, of course, each country being very different. One of the questions that we received from our Zoom participants in advance was why do you think you were appointed ambassador to Ukraine, but of course other countries as well. Perhaps talk a little bit about your path within the State Department that allowed you finally to achieve the exalted rank of ambassador in the State Department. It really is the top rank, of course, for a Foreign Service officer. Very few individuals make that step. So talk a little bit about both the path, the challenges you faced, and one questioner asked, what did you particularly like? What were some of your positive experiences as ambassador? We certainly are going to talk about some of the challenges that you faced during that time, but talk a little bit maybe about navigating a department. I also was at the State Department, and it has not always been the most hospitable place for women. I will just say too, that when I was an intern at the State Department, up until I think in the 1970s, perhaps, any woman who married had to leave the Foreign Service. You were simply not allowed to serve. So talk a little bit about your own path. And again, sort of the experience of being an ambassador, both the political interactions that you have with government officials, but also what gave you pleasure in that job.
Well, there's a lot of questions in
Yes,
that, so
I
I
know.
hope I hope I can get to all of them. But I'll just start with what it was like to be a woman in the Foreign Service. So I came in around, it sounds like around the same time in 1976. I'm sorry, in 1986, so 10 years later. And it was still a very male-dominated place. The State Department reflected our society. Just as I can see some people nodding, especially women. The State Department reflected our society just as the military does. And so, you know, what was happening in the State Department was not that different from what was happening in society as a whole, although the State Department has, you know, particular challenges for any career. You change your job every couple of years, and not just your job, often you're changing where you live, right? You're moving to a whole different country. So lots of challenges there. But with the State Department at that time, and we continue using this phrase today, it was called Pale, Male, and Yale. So not a lot of diversity there. And I should, you know, just confess at the outset, I did go to Princeton, so maybe I qualify for two of those things, but I was definitely not male. And at that time, you know, all of the bosses, for the most part, with, you know, very rare exceptions, were men. And they, you know, for the most part, felt that this was a career for men, and that they resisted some of the legislation that was coming our way to reform the State Department. And they were also resisting a lawsuit that was brought against the State Department, a class action lawsuit that was brought. And the State Department fought that lawsuit to open up opportunities for women for decades, absolute decades. So this was an ongoing issue of conversation, and how bad this lawsuit was, and how, you know, women shouldn't be participating in this lawsuit, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, taking opportunities away from men with families. I mean, all of the arguments that you have heard. And I was hearing this as I was coming into the State Department. So I was like, I don't want to be a part of that. And, you know, just sort of kept my head down and thought, you know, what I need to do is be really good at what I do, so that I'm offered the opportunities that I'm looking for to, you know, again, contribute. So, but it was very hard to break into the political specialty, which is why I wanted to join the Foreign Service. I wanted to be doing political analysis. I wanted to be doing representation. I wanted to be doing negotiation. I didn't want to be doing what I was assigned to do when I came into the Foreign Service. I was assigned the specialty of administrative help. And that wasn't why I joined the Foreign Service. So I tried all sorts of different things. None of it worked. And in 1992, I was given, you know, I was sent a letter. Actually, in those days we got letters, not emails. And I was told that that the State Department had lost this case, that the appellate court had found that the State Department had discriminated against women in terms of the questions on the exam, how they brought women into the Foreign Service, the specialties they assigned them, the jobs they gave them, and on promotions. So clean sweep, pretty much across the board, the State Department was found to discriminate against women. And that as one of the remedies, and there were many remedies that the court ordered, 14 spaces were going to be made available to women to change their specialty if they so desired. And did I qualified under, the definition of the court, and therefore did I want to compete for one of those 14 slots? And I thought about it. I thought about it really hard because there was so much resistance in the State Department to anything that came out of this lawsuit. And I thought, if I tell anybody that I'm participating in this, even though this is a path to get what I want, I will be told, that I don't deserve that seat at the table, that it was only because some judge, made an incorrect decision that I'm at the table. And so I thought, well, I really want this. And so I am going to compete for one of these 14 slots, and I'm not going to tell anybody at the State Department. So I competed and I got that slot. And I got, as a result, I got a job in Embassy Moscow as a political officer in 1993. That job changed my life and put me on the trajectory to becoming an ambassador because I was starting to do the kinds of jobs and assignments that enabled me to show what I could do. I was loving it. And therefore, I think one excels at what one loves. And so I was doing really well. But I never told anybody that I had been a participant in this class action lawsuit until I wrote the book. Because I just, at every stage, even after 3 ambassadorships, there was still, the little devil on my shoulder saying, are you really good enough for this job? The gaslighting that we heard that women weren't good enough, that they were only getting these jobs because of a lawsuit or whatever it might be, was really powerful in my head, and it was hard to break out of it. So, so I never told anybody through all those years where I had clearly demonstrated that I did deserve a seat at the table. And when I wrote the book, I thought, do I put this in? Do I put this story of how I became a political officer and then ultimately an ambassador? Do I talk about that trajectory and kind of the mood, shall we say, the environment at the State Department and how unwelcoming it was to women? And there were other things as well. I mean, for example, to this day, the State Department has not, this is kind of a funny and maybe a gross one and maybe not appropriate for this audience, but to this day, the State Department has not renovated the lavatories at the State Department. So all the women's rooms have urinals. And, and when I, was of sufficient stature, I was a deputy assistant secretary, I complained. And I was told, well, a lot of women prefer them. And I was like, no, you don't. Then I thought, well, maybe he knows something. So I asked my friends, and they confirmed I was indeed correct. But so it's things like that kind of send little signals that you don't belong here. We're not gonna make space for you. And yeah, so when I wrote the book, I thought I need to include some of this in here because sadly, the State Department, just like American society, really, we haven't gotten to that place yet of full equality for women. And I thought, it's important to let people, the next generation know not only the good things, although all the things I loved about the Foreign Service and the many adventures I had, but to also share that there were a lot of challenges along the way and you need to persevere. There are going to be hard times and you just need to keep on going. And if you fail, you need to keep on going and you will get there in the end. So that was a very long way of telling you how I got to be ambassador. So why was I selected to be ambassador? I think that partly, honestly, I think I was good at my job. That's the first thing. You need to be good at your job. But the second thing was that I was lucky because when I was coming up, I was interested in the Soviet Union and then the former Soviet Union. I served in a lot of those countries, Russia, Armenia, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, et cetera. And in 1991, when the Soviet Union fell apart, it went from being one country, one ambassador, well, just one ambassador, to 16 countries, 16 ambassadors needed, 16 embassies needed, 16 staff. And so I had an opportunity to work all over that space, really develop an expertise and obviously language ability as well. And so when they were looking for ambassadors, you know, when my time came that I was in that zone, shall we say, I was clearly a candidate. The other thing that was very lucky was that, so this was in the early aughts, really, that I was in the zone to start to be considered for leadership positions in embassies. And this was when the State Department was starting to feel embarrassed that they didn't have women in leadership roles. And Jim Baker, who, you know, I would never have thought of as, you know, a champion for women's rights, but he basically told the department, and this is going back to the 1990s, he basically told the Department of State, you need to have one woman in a leadership position, deputy assistant secretary position in each bureau. And the bureaucracy came back and said, can't do it. There's nobody at the State Department that could possibly do these jobs. And he's like, well, find them, because you are going to have one woman in a leadership position in each front office. And somehow they were able to find some women who could actually do the job somehow. And I'm sure not all of them succeeded, but enough of them succeeded that it started becoming, you know, something that one does. One doesn't overlook the women, one includes them and everything else. Then the next Secretary of State was Madeleine Albright. Enough said. She was promoting women forward, right? And so by the time my time came around, they were really looking for women, because I will tell you, even when I was ambassador, I would like look around when we would have ambassadors conferences, I would look around the room and I would count minorities and I would count women. And often we were a twofer. It was scandalous, really. But I benefited from that the department was looking for women, and that my area of expertise suddenly had all these openings for ambassadors. So I think, you know, the lesson I drew from that, and from many things in my career, is you need to be good. You need to work hard. You need to have good judgment. You need to have all those qualities that any executive needs. But you also have to be lucky.
Well, thank you very much. And it's interesting because it was right after that time that I became Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Trade Policy, 1992 to 1995, and was brought in at that time. I also, just interestingly enough, you know, I noticed you were in Moscow in 1993, because that's 2 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union. I was on Capitol Hill on the House Ways and Means Committee, working on trade legislation, normalizing trade relations with suddenly all these new countries. I was the person handling that. So you're right, your knowledge of, we kind of knew that the Soviet Union was made up of lots of different republics, but we really, as Americans, I think, did not know that much about them. We learned a lot more. And that brings us, and I want to be conscious of our time, that brings us to, of course, one of the former Soviet states, Ukraine. Now, Ukraine was instrumental in the breakup of the Soviet Union. I think we now see, we look at what Russia under Vladimir Putin has been doing since 2014 with incursions into Crimea and then eastern Ukraine, with a full-blown assault in February of 2022. I'd like you to talk a little bit about what you see as the stakes in this fight, in this war. There are both long-term and shorter-term stakes. We have, again, I'm combining some questions too that people have had. China, for example, has its eyes on Taiwan. Xi Jinping is very carefully watching what is happening to Russia and its troops in Ukraine. We have other autocrats around the world too, who are wondering whether a democracy can survive an assault. So are we looking here, what are the stakes for Ukraine and Europe? Why should we in the United States care? And I would just add, for those of you who have not seen the news today, of course, we have Congress careening towards a shutdown of government. They took a vote today in which 1/2 of the Republicans in the U.S. House of Representatives voted against a particular aid package, military aid package to Ukraine. Our own congressman is one of those. But how do you tell people why we should support Ukraine in this battle? And what are the broader implications? And as one questioner said, is this a turning point in history? Is this a pivotal moment in history?
Yeah.
Big question, but there you go.
Yeah, so I actually, starting with the last thing first, I actually do think that this is one of those moments in history that I think that when the historians write the story of our era, they're going to look at how the US and the West handle the challenge that Russia is posing right now. And I think that is going to be sort of the seminal story of our age. It's certainly the biggest challenge that I've seen over the course of my career. I thought it was 9/11 at first. And obviously that was a huge and profound shock to the United States and the world. But we were able to manage that in a way that actually did not end up being as disruptive as I thought it would be initially. I think this is something different that we're seeing now from Russia. So, I mean, I think these are all good questions because, you know, Ukraine is far away. I mean, a lot of people couldn't even find Ukraine on a map probably a year and a half ago. And we have so many of our own challenges here in the United States. And why should we be spending so much money to help Ukraine defend itself against Russia, even under the circumstances where you have a totalitarian state brutally invading another neighboring country with no provocation, and even under those circumstances. And I think there are a couple of different reasons why we need to help Ukraine as much as we can, sending as much equipment as fast as possible. And the first reason is this is in keeping with our values. And we are, if we are nothing else, we are a nation of values. We are still, in my opinion, you know, as Ronald Reagan used to say, the shining city on the hill. And when I go, you know, back to Ukraine, I've been to Ukraine 4 times since the war started. Ukrainians still look to us and Europeans still look to us. And that is first and foremost, not because of our big economy, not because of our big and mighty military, it's because of our values, it's because we stand for something. And, you know, we've had a number of rough years, and I'm not only talking about the Trump years, but even before, where things have been kind of shaky. But I think that in terms of focusing on, you know, building up our democracy, on supporting our allies, all of our traditional values, we are definitely coming back, and countries are looking for that American leadership again. And so when I look at Ukraine, you know, a democracy, a struggling democracy, all democracies are struggling democracies because, you know, it's just a constant work to keep our democracy, other democracies, you know, strong. But I think this is in keeping with our values to help a democracy, a country that wants to, that is a part of Europe, wants to join European institutions, and will make Europe stronger if it is a formal part of Europe. That is in keeping with our values, with who we are. More critically, I would say that it's also in keeping with our interests, because Vladimir Putin has made very clear over the last 20 plus years of his reign in Russia that he wants to recreate the Russian Empire. He has told us that, I mean, he literally says he wants, you know, the historically Russian lands. And if you look at historic maps of what that might include, it includes parts of Poland, it includes the Baltic countries, it includes countries further south. So that would be a real concern to us. Many of these countries are members of NATO, and it would completely, obviously, destabilize Europe if he were to go that far. He's told us this in his writings, he's told us this in his speeches, and he's told us this in his actions. In 2008, Russia invaded Georgia, the country of Georgia, grabbing 2 hunks of territory and basically controlling them. In 2014, 2015, as you were saying, Russia invaded Ukraine for the first time, seizing Crimea illegally and starting that war in the Donbass in eastern Ukraine that kept the country, in a destabilized state. It was, not a war that made a lot of headlines in the United States, but 2 to 3 people died every week. I mean, some of them were soldiers. A lot of them were civilians who were on the front lines because their village happened to be on the front line that day. Just really, really bad luck. And so that war continued until the all-out war, the total Russian invasion of 2022. And, the US did something really interesting, which was to share intelligence, not only with our allies, our close allies, but with Ukraine, and then ultimately with the public, so that Russia would be put on the back foot about its intentions to invade. And that was a very, very interesting moment. And, the country also put out information that not only did Russia want to invade, it wanted to invade all of Ukraine and control all of Ukraine. And that was something I have to say that surprised me, I knew Russia wasn't done in 2014, 2015, but I thought they would try to destabilize other countries. That sort of the low level war was enough for Russia, but it turned out not to be. They wanted to control all of Ukraine because, as Vladimir Putin has said, there are no Ukrainian people, there is no Ukrainian language, there is no Ukraine, there is no Ukrainian culture. And therefore, he felt perfectly justified in taking over Ukraine, which is populated in Russian views by little Russians, not Ukrainians, little Russians. And so he started this all-out war. And so this is a tragedy for Ukraine, that their country and their people would be destroyed. But if Vladimir Putin is successful, Ukrainians will either be Russified, they will become Russians under Russian control, or they will be killed. And that is not acceptable. So the Ukrainians will continue to fight on. But if Russia is successful, what will happen is, I think that Russia will continue at some point. Russia does have strategic patience. So they waited a number of years after 2015 before this all-out assault till 2022. But they will continue. I mean, that is very clear to me. We would probably need to address the Russian threat at a later time, a time not of our choosing, perhaps not to our advantage, and at a time that might not be successful for us. And so for us, when I look at this contest, this war in Ukraine right now, obviously, first and foremost, it is about Ukraine and Vladimir Putin's obsession about Ukraine, but it is also about our national security, because it is to our advantage to have Russia stopped in Ukraine. Right now, we are spending, before these budget discussions, we are spending about 5% of our annual military budget to assist Ukraine, 5%. It goes up if you also consider economic assistance and so forth, but 5% on the military side. And with that, the Ukrainians are decimating Russian capability. Russia is a country that has been determined by both NATO, the United States, is a threat to European and global stability. So the Ukrainians are basically doing our job for us with no American boots on the ground, 5% of our annual defense budget. So imagine if we decide that we can no longer afford or don't want to, for some reason, support Ukraine. Imagine that. Ukraine is very dependent on our assistance, on Western assistance in general. And I think the rest of the allies are looking to us for leadership. If we pull out of that leadership slot, I'm not sure what's going to happen with the rest of Western support for Ukraine. So Ukraine would be on its own, continuing to fight the Russians. They will not stop because it is an existential battle for them. They know what this is about. But it will be a very difficult issue. And I think Russia will be emboldened. It will continue further. And if we have to deal with Russia at a later date, do you think it's going to be 5% of our annual defense budget? I think it's going to be much greater. And it will not only be a cost in terms of funding, of treasure, but there will be a cost in American blood as well. And so I think we need to you know, it's sometimes hard when we have all these priorities and we have, you know, short-term needs and long-term needs to think about the longer-term needs, because right now Russia is not directly threatening the United States. But I think there will, if we allow Russia to trample Ukraine, there will come that time, and it's better to deal with these kinds of threats earlier than later. I would also say that what happens in Russia, as you suggested, if Russia is successful, not only will Russia be emboldened, but other countries will be emboldened as well. And so I think that the road to success with China is straight through Ukraine, because if we can't get Ukraine right now, we're not going to be able to get Taiwan right. We're just not going to be able to do it, because I think that leaders, totalitarian leaders, will make their decision, their assessment that the US, the West, is not going to stand up for its values, it's not going to stand up for its interests, and it's not going to stand up for its partners and allies. And so they will continue to press. And you know, where does that line come? And so I think it's best if we continue to support Ukraine now, because Ukraine can win. And while I think many people have been disappointed, openly so in Washington, about the trajectory of the counteroffensive this spring and the summer, I think now you're seeing some really major tactical moves on the Ukrainian part, victories really, that both on the land and on the sea, in the Black Sea. I mean, it's nothing short of remarkable, given what they're facing. And so I'm very hopeful that Ukraine will prevail in this fight, and it needs to prevail in this fight. That's why we need to support them.
I think those are all excellent points. And one thing I would just add is to the extent that Russia's aggression continues, which I agree, you look at the history, it will. The three Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, who are up there on the Baltic Sea, are deathly afraid of Russian incursion. They have been warning Europe and the West, the Americans, for many years not to trust Putin. And of course, for many years we didn't. But if there were to be aggression further by Vladimir Putin in Europe, it would involve a NATO member. That draws us in directly. And I would say, in terms of a Montana interest, you consider the fact that in this state, we have about the highest rate of enlistment in the military and in the National Guard. And so if we care about where our sons and daughters are going to be serving, and we don't want them in a wider war in Europe against Russia, again, I would agree with the ambassador. I think it's very important to send a message not only to Vladimir Putin, but to other autocrats and to Xi Jinping, that we will stand by countries that are fighting for their independence. And it is ironic because Xi Jinping and the Chinese very constantly remind us the importance of territorial integrity and sovereignty, both of which are being trampled by Russia in Ukraine, and yet China will not speak out against this war. So I think the stakes are tremendous, and I think you've outlined it very well.
Yeah.
I'm conscious of our time. I do want to get to questions both in the audience here and by our Zoom, but I do want to ask, let's spend just a brief time talking about the challenges to democracy in Ukraine. One of the things that members of Congress and others who oppose aid to Ukraine frequently will say is there's so much corruption there. Their judiciary can't be relied on. Why should we be supporting a country that is has so many problems? And of course, you know, they are aware of that, but could you talk a little bit about some of the challenges they face and what Zelensky himself is doing in the fight against corruption? And that was a fight that you were engaged in as well as ambassador.
Yeah, so I think that's a really important question, because I certainly felt as ambassador when we were providing assistance to foreign countries, I wanted to make sure that that assistance was going to where Congress intended it to go and not into somebody's pocket and so forth. That is really, really critical. And no more so than now when we are providing a lot of assistance to Ukraine. I would note that all the former Soviet Union countries have had really serious challenges with corruption. And that's because it's a Soviet legacy. I mean, sometimes we forget that government is here to serve the people, not the other way around. But in the Soviet Union, the government was all about itself. The leadership was all about itself. And the people were just there as little work cogs to, feed the government. And so, people are going to find a way if their child needs medication, if, their child needs an education, whatever the issue might be, people are going to find a way to get that. And that means greasing somebody's palm. And so that was the lubricant in the former Soviet Union to get things done. When you had a 3-year wait to get a telephone, and I'm not talking about a cell phone, I'm talking about landlines because that was back in the day, a 3-year wait. I mean, you would find the little guy at the telephone office who would put your telephone in, like tomorrow, rather than wait 3 years. And so that was, kind of at the daily level. At the senior levels, the leadership levels, they were stealing the Soviet Union blind. And there was a, that phrase from Animal Farm, some animals were more equal than others. Well, if you were a leader in the Soviet Union, you were very equal. You had resorts, you had access to all sorts of funding, you could travel abroad, you had a completely different life from everybody else, the millions, the hundreds of millions of people who were suffering under communism. And so in 1991, when the Soviet Union fell apart, it's not like everything magically changed, right? It's still the same people, the same leaders. And the leaders of the 16 new countries, with the exception of, the Baltic countries, they liked the old system, right? It was working for them after all. And so there wasn't a real impetus to make change, but slowly over time, as civil society sort of learned how to ask for change, then demand change, because in the Soviet era, if you showed any initiative at all, you were going to be punished because no independent thinking was allowed, even if that was something like complaining that the school, gymnasium wasn't good for the kids and could we get it improved? No criticism, no initiative, nothing like that. So the people of these countries in 1991 weren't quite ready to assume the roles of an active and engaged and literate civil society. But over time, they became very, very literate and very active, and especially so in Ukraine. So there was the Orange Revolution in 2004, which started because of totally peaceful revolution, because presidential elections were fiddled and the people won. And when they won, they went back to their daily lives and they said, we're going to let the politicians, sort through the future because the right guy now has won. That guy turned out to be a big disappointment also, unfortunately. And so fast forward to 2014, 10 years later, and the Ukrainians had another revolution. This one was called the Revolution of Dignity. And what it meant was, I want to live according to the rule of law. I don't want to have to give a bribe to the policeman just so that I can keep on, driving along this road when I've done nothing wrong. And when, I am held to a different standard than the president, who has stolen 40 billion is the estimate, $40 billion from the Ukrainian people. I want him to be held accountable just as I would be held accountable if I stole something. Everybody should be subject to the same law. And that was in 2014, the Revolution of Dignity. And Yanukovych, who was the president at the time, he fled to Russia with his money, and a new president came in, and he had a very strong mandate. I mean, he wasn't really a reformer himself, but he had a strong mandate and he knew it. And the oligarchs in Ukraine were afraid because they could see that the people wanted rule of law and an end to corruption. And so the reformers in civil society, the reformers in the government, and there were many, and the international community, the US, the EU, the international banks, we all came together for that same goal of holding Ukrainian governmental feet to the fire to move forward on these reforms. And so it kind of makes me a little bit mad because I think it's so unfair when people talk about how corrupt Ukraine is. On the one hand, that's true. On the other hand, the reason we talk about that is because the Ukrainian people themselves put that on the table and said, we don't want to live this way. we want to change this and we want your help to do it. And over the next couple of years, they actually did make a lot of strides. But, corruption is one of those problems that, it's generational change, because it's not only changing and establishing institutions, putting in new laws and regulations, it's also changing culture, right? How people think and what they expect, not only of their leaders, but of themselves. And that is, a long, long haul. And so for us to think that that Ukraine changed, a lot of progress has been made, mostly in people's expectations. But to think that, everything changed when the Russians invaded, that's not the case. But they continue to make reforms. Zelensky has appointed a number of good people. He's also just fired, famously, a number of people in the military that were recruiting, that were in charge of recruitment and were being paid bribes not to take my son, right? Take that other guy's son. The work continues. I would say that the embassy is very, very clear. Our embassy in Ukraine is very clear that on the items that we track, we don't track every bullet, but the big systems that we do track, that nothing has been displaced or stolen or resold or anything like that. And Zelensky and the people around him and those in leadership positions in the military, and frankly, just the rank and file, they know that if we were to find out that that was the case, that our assistance would be in grave jeopardy, that they would be playing into the hands of Russia. And so I think they are very, very careful, certainly about what we provide. I'm pretty confident of that. But, the fight against corruption continues, and it will continue for some time. But I think ultimately it will be successful. And the reason I think this is I look at the Ukrainian people, and you all have seen, interviews with people on TV, and, just the grit and the courage that they are demonstrating in fighting against the Russians. Every Ukrainian is doing whatever they think is necessary to help. And they feel equally that they should be living in a country of the rule of law, not, some arbitrary man telling them, who can get away with bribery and who can't. And when I look at them and I think about Ukraine after the war, these are not people who are fighting on the front lines, fighting in their, even in their cities as they're defending themselves from Russian air raids, to make the oligarchs rich again. That's not why they're fighting. They're fighting for a new Ukraine, a Ukraine that will provide for their children, that will be a part of the EU and Europe, and that will be governed according to the rule of law. I'm really convinced of that. And so I put my faith in the Ukrainian people, basically.
Thank you. And I think you also said something that bears underscoring, and that is the role of civil society in maintaining a strong democracy. We in the United States take it very much for granted. We've got lots of civic engagement, small groups, bigger groups. We mobilize. When there's an issue that concerns us, we get a grassroots effort to try and change things, whether it's at the city level, state, federal. As you were saying, under a Soviet, very dictatorial system, the people do not have that ability. In fact, as you say, they are punished or killed if they try to do so. And so that also is a learning process, and it's something that takes some learning. And there has been a lot of American and European support for building of civil society as well. So let's all hope that they continue on this path. And I think it has been good to see the president really taking a firm step in the middle of war, trying to still deal with this domestic issue. The last question I would like—
I would just add one point. It is important that Ukraine win the war, but it is also important that Ukraine win the peace. And this is going to be one critical part of that.
Very good point. Last question before I open it up to the audience. You've alluded to this. Ukraine has long sought membership in the European Union and in NATO. The European Union just last June put Ukraine on a path to membership. They made it a candidate country. At NATO, at a summit in July this year, heads of state said that Ukraine will be a member of NATO, but didn't set a timetable. They said, you know, when it's ready and when we decide. There are some people who say, well, and of course, others who argue this has been a cause of the war, but some people who say we shouldn't really be pursuing NATO membership for Ukraine because it would be too provocative to Russia. So could you talk a little about their aspirations for EU and NATO membership, and then how you would respond to people who say this is something that is just too provocative to Russia and we should avoid this?
Right. So I have always thought that Ukraine should be a member of the EU, and that's certainly been U.S. policy to help Ukraine become as close to the EU as possible. Because that helps us. It helps our businesses. If Ukraine is tied into the European economy and is following, Western European rules and standards, that helps our companies. And part of that, of course, is reforming the judiciary. So there's a level playing field for all companies, not just Ukrainian companies. And so I've always felt that the EU was a really important piece for Ukrainian prosperity, for Ukrainians, but also really it's also part of the security piece. With NATO, I was not sure that Ukraine should join NATO, and part of that was I didn't feel that Ukraine was ready, both in terms of their military and the lack of military reform that I saw when I was there as ambassador. And also, we call NATO a marriage of civil societies. The reason that NATO is the single most successful defense pact in the history of the world, that's a long time and a lot of space. The reason it's been so successful is that it is an organization that is based on common values. It's democratic values, and in the first paragraph of the Washington Treaty, which is the treaty that establishes NATO, it talks about we believe in democracy, we believe in rule of law, and we believe in the rights of the individual. And so it sets it right out there in three quick phrases that these are our common values. And that is what has kind of knitted this organization together since 1948. It's not just this ad hoc thing that comes together whenever there might be a threat, but an ongoing organization that works for the security of the European space. And, now I feel that, Ukraine has made a lot of reforms in its military. It still needs to make more. But it has made a lot of reforms in the military. At one point, if Ukraine had joined NATO, I think we all would have said that it would be Ukraine that was benefiting from the European and the American military. I think now we can pretty confidently say that Ukraine has a very capable military that would add a lot of value to NATO, a lot of value. And Ukraine is working on its own democracy in terms of the values piece as well. I think that it would, to those who say that it's a provocation to Russia, in 2008, famously at the Bucharest summit, membership for for Georgia and for Ukraine was kind of put on the table, but in a very vague way that didn't talk about timelines or when it would happen or how it would happen. And what happened then? Shortly thereafter, Russia invaded Georgia. And then in 2014, it invaded Ukraine. So I would say actually that the lack of NATO membership is more provocative, because counterintuitively, when the US is strong, when NATO is strong, bullies like Putin, totalitarian states like Russia and China, they understand that. When we wring our hands and say, oh my gosh, do we really want to send ATACMS? That could be provocative to Russia. Oh my gosh. On the one hand, as an American citizen, I'm glad that our leadership is seriously considering and debating every step of what we do, because these are important issues and we want to get them right. On the other hand, if anybody thinks that Vladimir Putin is seeing this debate in the United States and going, what a great global citizen we are in the United States. We're thinking about what could be provocative, what isn't provocative, and we're holding ourselves back because we don't want to make Putin mad. He doesn't see strength there. He sees weakness that he can take advantage of because he's a bully. And when we push back, he has, including in this war, he pulls back because he understands strength, and that's about the only thing he understands. I'll give you two examples. One, famously, among the many miscalculations Putin made, is he wanted to reduce NATO, and what he's getting is, an expanded NATO. Not even talking about Ukraine, with Finland joining, and soon Sweden will as well. And when that came out in the news, Putin blustered on about the nuclear threat. And, nobody batted an eye, the plans just continued. And we never heard any more about the nuclear threat in that context. We have heard about it in other contexts. And I would remind you that last fall, the US pushed back, not only privately with the Russians, very, very strongly, but also publicly, letting the Russians know that if they use tactical nukes, that this would be a disaster for them. And we also, I think, use diplomacy through third parties, not only our allies in Europe reaching out to Russia and saying this would be a huge mistake, but also China and India, letting them do part of that work, because they don't want to see Russia using tactical nukes either, for their own reasons, but nevertheless, there was a convergence of interests. So I don't think that there's much validity to that argument. And in fact, when in the early 2000s, when NATO enlarged with a number of countries, there was no pushback from Russia at all. I don't think, and in fact, in that same time period, all three men, Putin himself, President Clinton, and President Bush, have all told us publicly that there were conversations, if you can believe it, about Russia possibly joining NATO at some point in the future. So it was a very different, obviously environment at that time, but the recreation of history that Putin has given, that it was all about NATO and this war is all about NATO and everything else, I think he's just, as so often happens with disinformation, you're just putting up different trial balloons to see what will work and what will people fall for. And I think on this one, there are a number of Americans and others who are concerned that maybe enlarging to include Ukraine would not be a wise move. Here's the other thing that I would say. Ultimately, this war will end. And Ukraine will still be where Ukraine is located, and Russia will still be located where Russia is located. They will be neighbors. And there is a history, not only a recent history, but a history over the centuries of Russia and Ukraine going to war in one way or another. And, one of the things that NATO is really good at is preventing wars, actually. And so if Ukraine is just out there as kind of a free radical, wondering whether in another war, whether the West would come to support Ukraine or not, never trusting Russia, of course, worried that it needs to become as strong and resilient as possible to be ready for another Russian attack. And whenever you have those kinds of dynamics, it's easy to make mistakes, right? Where one country is arming up, the other country sees the other country arming up, and oh my God, oh my God. So mistakes are possible. And Ukraine, just a free radical out there. But if Ukraine is a part of NATO, that not only bestows privileges on Ukraine, but it also comes with responsibilities that Ukraine can't just be, attacking another country willy-nilly. And if they were to feel insecure, but mostly it would make Ukraine feel secure that it wouldn't have to take any action because NATO would be supporting Ukraine. So it's a complicated issue. I think, one that will be continued to be discussed and debated over the next year, because there's another NATO summit coming up in July in Washington. It will be the 75th anniversary of NATO's establishment. It will be an historic summit, if only for that. But I think it's going to be an historic summit in terms of how we manage the Ukraine question. And I hope that we will be more forthcoming in terms of possible membership for Ukraine and NATO.
And it'll be very interesting to see next summer where the situation in Ukraine is. Let's hope that they can hold on and in fact push back Russia, and perhaps even be by next year talking about perhaps the next steps. And it's just, as you say, it's such a tragic situation in Ukraine. And the irony being that NATO is now stronger than it probably ever has been. More unity and more recognition of
And
its
more
reasons
capabilities.
and more capability. So with that, I do want to open this up for questions. I'm sure there are a lot. There are two people. Where are the people with microphones? There's one, two here. I think we'll have, okay. What I plan to do is have one question in person and then one question from our Zoom audience. There will be somebody who will read the questions from the Zoom audience. So let's begin here in person. Who would like to venture the first question here? Yes, sir, over here in the blue shirt.
Hi, I was wondering that as you talk about the United States being the shiny city on the hill, but when it comes to Ukraine, I've heard some Russian sources claim that America has lost some of its moral authority with its interventions and regime change wars of the 2000s in Afghanistan, Iraq, and then later in Libya. Is that at all true? Has America opened the way for Russia to invade Ukraine? Has it, our interventions made it like gotten rid of our moral high ground and given Russia the justification to invade its neighbors?
Well, that's what Russia would say, as you pointed out. So
Yeah.
consider the source. I think, when it comes to Afghanistan, I mean, we were attacked and we responded, and the whole world responded with us, including, I would add, Russia. The first phone call from a foreign leader that President Bush got was from Vladimir Putin, talking about, how Russia was with the United States. And, within less than 24 hours, we had a NATO resolution going to Article 5, which is, a defense of, one is a defense for all. I think that's the way it goes. Pretty soon there was a UN Security Council resolution as well. I think that was a war that was fully, war is a terrible thing under any circumstance, don't get me wrong, but I think that was a war that was fully defensible. On Iraq, the great thing about no longer working for the US government is that I don't have to defend Iraq. So I would say, that was a war of choice, and it was not probably the best decision that we ever made there. But here's what I would say to the Russians. If that was so wrong, why are you invading Ukraine? I mean, you're criticizing that and saying that that justifies you doing a terrible thing too. That makes no sense at all. So I just think there are flaws in Russian logic, as is so often the case.
And
Thank you.
now a question from the Zoom.
Absolutely. We will go ahead and take a question from our Zoom audience. So our first question from Zoom is, what is the significance of Ukraine serving as the breadbasket of the region and in some ways the world?
Yeah, well, that is such an important question because we've seen that with the Russians backtracking on their on the grain deal that Turkey negotiated between Ukraine and Russia, that very few grain supplies of all different kinds, wheat, sunflower oil, it goes on and on and on the list, and which goes to countries in Asia, countries in Africa, and countries that need these supplies. Very little is getting through, and the Russians are deliberately destroying Ukrainian capacity. So not only the ships that transport these cargoes, but the supply, sorry, I'm getting tired. I think the silos that store the grain, the farms, the fields, the port infrastructure, and so forth. But the Ukrainians are not giving up. I've read a lot of reports over the last 2 weeks of vessels that are actually getting through in the traditional Black Sea routes, but also through new routes in Europe along the Danube, primarily through Romania. We need to hold Russia to account on this because this is a terrible spillover effect of a terrible war. And the Ukrainians are trying to do everything they can to get these supplies out.
And if I can just add on that too, in terms of Ukraine being a breadbasket, the impact of Russia's attack and interrupting these supplies has caused tremendous shortages and price increases around the world, particularly in Africa and developing countries or global south. Egypt, for example, before the war imported 80% of its wheat from Ukraine. Suddenly it can't get that wheat. What are the people in Egypt supposed to do? So African heads of state have been also criticizing Russia for this. And you're right, Ukraine being such an important supplier and it's impacting people around the world.
But interestingly, for most of the evening, we've been talking about countries that support Ukraine, of which there are many, but there are also countries that are fence sitters or who, have longstanding relationships with Russia or China. And so, don't want to rock that boat. And so, a number of those countries are like, just whatever, come to a deal on grain, but also end this war so that my grain supplies aren't disrupted. So it's a very complicated issue.
Gentleman here in the gray jacket that would be you. You are a gentleman, I can tell.
Ambassador, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah.
And I really look forward to reading your book. I'd like to focus on Crimea for a moment. With the Russians occupying Crimea, a lot of their propaganda is about how many of their Crimeans are welcoming them back and being a part of Russia again. What's the reality about the attitude of the average person who lives in Crimea? And is it divided? Are they all against it? Are they all for it? What's your view on that?
Yeah. So, polling shows that before the war, which started in 2014, before the war, Crimeans, which are majority Russian, the population that is in Crimea is majority Russian and Russian speaking, that they wanted to stay in Ukraine in the status that they have now. Polling now, which may or may not be reliable, says the opposite. But here's the important thing to think about Crimea. So the Russians talk about how Catherine the Great, won Crimea and how this is a Russian area and everything else. But before that, it was a Crimean Khanate. And the Crimean Tatars continued to live in Crimea all through the Russian Empire. And during World War II, what happened, it's a real tragedy. Stalin moved a lot of populations that he felt might not be loyal to the Soviet Union. So he deported all of the Crimean Tatars who have historically lived in that country for centuries, well before the Russians. He deported them all to Central Asia, to places like Uzbekistan. And they were only allowed to come back when the Soviet Union fell apart in 1991. And so you had all these Crimeans coming back to their homeland and being able to, practice their religion and to practice their culture and their language and everything else in Crimea, as historically they've done. But over time, the Russians the Soviet Union had populated Crimea with Russians. And so it's a majority Russian-speaking population because since 1945, Russians were trucked there and placed there, and and they loved it there because it's a lot nicer being in Crimea with a kind of a semi-tropical kind of a climate in the Black Sea than it is to be living in the northern parts of Russia, right? So it's very complicated. When does history start? Does it start when Catherine the Great seized Crimea for Russia, or does it start before that? So the Russians don't talk, Putin doesn't talk about what happened before. He doesn't talk about what happened under Stalin because that's inconvenient, right? So you really need to look at the full picture. But right now, under international law, there's no question that the international boundaries of Ukraine include Crimea. And I will tell this audience, I met Vladimir Putin one time. It was in Kyiv in 2001, and the occasion was the celebration of Ukraine's 10-year independence as an independent country with the existing borders, which included Crimea. So, I mean, that was then, this is now. He's talking a different game right now. But the Ukrainians are pretty clear that they want to be living in their internationally recognized borders. And I think there's something else at work as well, which is that a month after the war started in 2020 or restarted in 2022, the Ukrainians were able to liberate a number of towns north of Kyiv. One of them was Bucha. And the Ukrainians saw what what Russian occupation meant. The rapes, the torture, the killing of innocent civilians, deportation of children. I mean, the list goes on and on. And I think when Zelensky says he doesn't want to leave any Ukrainian citizen behind in Russian occupied Ukrainian territory, I think he means it from the heart. I mean, I think he feels a real responsibility that if he says, okay, Russia can keep these Ukrainian territories, he's condemning those people to the life of what the poor Ukrainian citizens endured in Bucha. And that would be a very hard thing, I think, for any leader to do. So what we're seeing right now is really interesting. And I find it interesting that in some quarters it's being criticized, where the Ukrainians are definitely trying to pound Crimea and the Black Sea naval headquarters, the vessels, the Russian warships, et cetera, et cetera. And that is not only to retake Crimea in the simplest sense, but also going back to the previous question, to see if they can assert domination over the Ukrainians can assert domination over the Black Sea, because the Russians want to make the Black Sea a Russian lake. And there are a number of NATO countries that also border the Black Sea beyond Ukraine, which is of course not a NATO country. That is not in our interests. And so I think part of the reason that the 3 vessels that got through last week were successful is in part because of Ukrainian success in Crimea, in disabling a number of Russian warships, and frankly, hitting their leadership. It's hard for them to make decisions right now. So it's an interesting strategy.
Well, the ambassador has had a very long day. I want to allow maybe 2 more questions, and we can try to keep them short. And I wish we had more time. I'm going to go back to a Zoom question here.
There we go. Now it's on. We have another question from Zoom, pivoting away from Ukraine and towards the Foreign Service. We have a question from a student that says, would you encourage young women today to go into the Foreign Service? And if so, what advice would you give them?
I would encourage young women to join the Foreign Service. I would also encourage young men to join the Foreign Service. I think it is a great career. It's a way to give back. It's a way to also have an interesting and vibrant career that makes a difference in the lives of people that you meet in foreign countries, but also that protects and defends American interests and values. And so I strongly recommend a career in the Foreign Service. I think you need to think about it, because think about it hard and think about yourself and your personal situation, because as I mentioned before, comes with a lot of challenges. I mean, not everybody likes changing their job every 2 years, because you have to reestablish yourself every time, even though, over time, you know the people around, but it's a new job and you need to learn the ropes just like you would in any other job. And then that often comes with moving. And if you're married, that means moving your family. And what is your significant other going to do in that country? Can they work remotely? Are they going to get a job at the embassy? Can they work on the local economy? What if there's not a good school for the kids? So these are all challenges that Foreign Service officers, to a lesser extent, our colleagues in DOD face every time they move. And, that's not a life for everybody. And so just to be realistic about what level of change, constant change really, you can manage in your life. The other thing I would say, and I've alluded to this before, is there are challenges in the Foreign Service right now. There are challenges because we've been underfunded for decades. There are challenges because we haven't made some of the reforms that we need to make. Those challenges continue today. But for young people joining the Foreign Service today, you can be a part of the solution and make it a better institution, because it's an important institution that is part of our national security infrastructure, and it's a vital one. Because if we don't have vibrant diplomacy, if we don't have diplomats that can represent all of us overseas, every problem starts looking like a problem that only defense, DOD, the Department of Defense, can solve, because we don't have the diplomatic tool in our toolkit.
One more last question. I'm just going to call here in the front row. Oh, wait for the microphone. 1 second.
So my question has to do with both dealing with Russia and then also just kind of generically as we look forward, if this is truly a pivotal moment. How does diplomacy work when we're negotiating with autocrats, especially in a global economy where sanctions seem to have limited success?
Yeah, so. Repeat the question.
How does diplomacy work when negotiating with autocrats, especially in a global economy where sanctions seem to have limited success?
So that's a good question. That's what I thought you had said. Good question, because that's what I thought too. It's a good question. So I think with diplomacy and negotiating with autocrats, but also, sometimes with our best friends, we each have a deck of cards we can play, and everybody is looking out for themselves. And so how do you manage that? I mean, sometimes we manage that with sticks, like sanctions, and sanctions are, I think we've gotten better at implementing sanctions. So it's more surgical than the blunter instrument it was 20 years ago. But it's still not perfect. We see that sanctions are being evaded by Russia, by Iran, by other countries, North Korea. And they often only work the way we want them to work over time, a long time. So they're not perfect, but they're not our only card. I mean, we have other ways, other sticks, so to speak, but we also have carrots, ways that we can encourage countries to do what we would like them to do. And while it may sound, not ideal to be negotiating with dictators, with authoritarian leaders, and it certainly isn't, but we need to be in touch and communicating with the people that represent their country, whether we like them or not, whether they are evil or not. And because we live in a world of grays. I mean, I would love to tell you that every person I met in my diplomatic career was A1, person of integrity. That is not the case. And there were some people that I knew were, I would never have met with them as, just an individual, as an American citizen, because I knew they were bad people. But in my role as ambassador, in my role to try to get the best results for the American people, if they had influence in a particular area, I would meet with them, would talk to Washington, tell them what I was doing, usually, asking for forgiveness rather than permission. But we live in a world of grays, and it would be great if only good people were in charge, but that is not the case around the world. And so we need to be realistic. We need to see what we can accomplish, and sometimes we have to walk away. You just have to go into it wide, with your eyes wide open, with your carrots and your sticks ready, and go for it. One of the things that helps us in negotiations with dictators is the fact that we have a really strong alliance system. The US is strong. It's the strongest country in the world, but we are even stronger because we have partners and allies all across the world that will come with us into negotiations. That makes us a lot stronger too. And most dictators, they don't have that. They don't have that backup. They're on their own, even if they're strong.
Well, I'm going to draw the Q&A period to an end. I want to just take out one, sort of couple of sentences at the end of your book that I think both encapsulate your career, your sense of service, and also alluding to the previous question about should young people join the Foreign Service. And this is advice I think that's valid for all of us of whatever age, but I think for young people, these words just really struck me. So I'm just going to quote from towards the end of your book. You say, "The present is determined by the past and the actions that others took. But the future is determined by us and the actions we choose to take now. The outcome is not preordained. So we need to put our shoulders to the wheel and ensure that the chapter of history that we are writing today leaves the world a better place." And I think we can all say that Ambassador Yovanovitch has left the world a better place. Thank you. Thank you for coming. Really. And we're not done. This is great. We're not done yet. Governor, we're not done yet. I have one last thing to say before we break. I just want to say, though, that that we will continue with our 40th anniversary dialogue series this coming month. We have former Congresswoman Liz Cheney coming on October 5th, and former Governor and Mansfield Center Board Chair Mark Roscoe will be in conversation with her. Unfortunately, it is in person only at her request, and it is sold out. I know some of you are lucky enough to have tickets to that. On October 9th, we're going to have a full day of activities and visiting dignitaries to celebrate the 70th anniversary of the U.S.-Korea relations. And then on October 26th, we have a virtual dialogue on Chinese attempts at global media dominance. And all of that information is available on our website and on pamphlets that I think are spread around here. I just want to close by thanking Ambassador Yovanovitch both for her service, for her fortitude, for what she has done for this country and will continue to do, and for sharing her wisdom and her insights with us. So thank you very much. Thank you very much. I love your pen. It's great. Thank you.